Hi guys, Mr. Templeton here. Today I'm going to be reading Chapter 5 of Animal Farm to you. Before I do that, a quick message from the English department. We're really impressed with the work we've been getting. The quality of the work's been fantastic. We're slightly concerned that some of you are falling a little bit behind. I can't emphasise just how crucial it is that you keep up with our study of this text because it's going to be in your GCSE exam next year, and because we really care. We want to read your fantastic work and we want to give you the feedback that you deserve and see all of your fantastic ideas on the page again because we miss you so much. So today I'm reading chapter 5. As we read this chapter, I want you to think about two key themes, okay? One of them is manipulation through violence, and the other one is manipulation through language. Okay, we're going to see a lot of manipulation really come into fruition in this chapter. So that's what I'd like you to focus on. It's really crucial that you are taking notes, okay? All we're asking for you to upload for Tuesday's lesson is notes from the chapter based on this video, or based on your own notes from reading the chapter, focusing on those themes of manipulation. Okay, so that's all we're asking you to do, and perhaps if you've got time, it'd be great for you to blow up and annotate some of these key quotes that I'm going to tell you about as we read the text. As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. On every kind of pretext, she would run away from work and go to the drinking pool, where she would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. But there was also rumours of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely to the yard, flirting her long tail and chewing at a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. So remember to think about how Molly is presented here and why she's presented in that way. Molly, she said, I have something very serious to say to you. This morning I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men was standing on the other side of the hedge. I was a long way away, but I'm almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you and you were allowing him to stroke your nose. What does that mean, Molly? He didn't. I wasn't. It isn't true, cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. Molly, look me in the face. Do you give me your word of honour that that man was not stroking your nose? It isn't true, repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face. And the next moment she took to her heels and galloped away into the field. Okay, so not only do I want you to think about Molly here, I also want you to think about Clover and how she's presented here, almost as a motherly type figure. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw was a little pile of lump sugar and several bunches of ribbon of different colours. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that they had seen her on the other side of Willingdon. Okay, this is representative of Molly. This is representative of the bourgeois fleeing Russia during the Russian Revolution. She was between the shafts of a smart dog cart painted red and black, which was standing outside a public house. A fat, red-faced man in cheek breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon round her forelock. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeons said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. In January there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in a big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. Okay, so here Orwell is just commenting on the fact that it's January, so it's going to be darker and bitter. But it's also a subtle use of prophetic fallacy to foreshadow the foreboding nature of this chapter. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were manifestly cleverer than the other animals, should decide all questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. Okay, so notice the pigs are on top again. You know, they were deciding everything. They were the smartest animals. And they get to create all the policies. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage with barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats. And if one of them said that such and such a field was just right for cabbages, the other would declare that it was useless for anything except roots. Each had his own following, and there were some violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself in between times. Okay, so think about the contrast of the two characters here. Remember, Snowball, representative of Trotsky during the Russian Revolution, Napoleon of Stalin, and their different approaches to gaining followers. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, the sheep had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the farmer and stock breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans for innovations and improvements. He talked learnedly about field drains, silage and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme of all the animals to drop their dung directly in the fields at a different spot every day to save the labour of cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that Snowball's would come to nothing and seemed to be biding his time. Okay, so we get a bit more foreshadowing here that Napoleon is up to something. Again, this contrast between Napoleon kind of inventing nothing and just talking down Snowball, with Snowball who's looking to try and create ideas to help the farm. But of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture, not far from the farm buildings, there was a small knoll which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which would be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mangle slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery. And they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work for them while they grazed at their ease in the fields or improved their minds with reading and conversation. Okay, so we get two kind of interesting quotes here. The bit in brackets where it says for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery is Orwell commenting on the lack of technology in Russia, because it was pre-industrial revolution for them largely. While they did have some machinery, they were nowhere near up to par with the likes of Britain at this time. And the other one is Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work for them. So it's really Orwell's trying to make Snowball seem like a really, really intelligent man, a really inventive man who's going to be the solution to all of their problems. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plan for the windmill were Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books which had belonged to Mr. Jones. 1,000 useful things to do about the house, every man his own bricklayer, and electricity for beginners. Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing on. He was closeted there for hours at a time, with his books held open by a stone and with a piece of chalk gripped between the knuckles of his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing in line after line and uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible, but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were at pains not to tread on the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. I want you to notice Napoleon's stand on the windmill and how it changes as the chapter goes on as well. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily round the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plans and snuffed at them once or twice, then stood for a little while contemplating them out of the corner of his eyes. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated over the plans and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be quarried and built up into walls. Then the sails would have to be made and that there would be need for dynamos and cables. How these were to be procured, Snowball did not say. Okay, that bit in brackets is quite interesting. He probably didn't say because they were probably going to import the resources they need from another farm. Of course, it was said that the pigs wouldn't trade with other farms. But he maintained it could all be done enough in a year, and thereafter he declared so much labour would be saved that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production, and if they wasted time on the windmill they would all starve to death. Okay, so Napoleon's trying to use fear in order to get his own way and to get his own political agenda across. The animals formed themselves into two factions under the slogans "Vote for Snowball" and the 3-day week, and "Vote for Napoleon" and the full manger. Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe that food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it had always gone on. That is, badly. Okay, this is probably my favourite quote in the whole text. Life would go on as it always had gone on. That is, badly. This is all while commenting on the fact that revolution and rebellion changes nothing. And he's also commenting on society in a bigger picture, not just in Russia. He's saying it doesn't matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter which politician is leading this nation. For the majority of people, life is going to be bad. Life is going to be poor. Apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was the question of the defence of the farm. It was fully realised that though the human beings had been defeated in the Battle of the Cowshed, they might make another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighbouring farms more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was to procure firearms and then train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they were bound to be conquered. The other argued that if rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon, then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. So because the animals aren't intelligent, it didn't matter who was talking, whether it was Napoleon or Snowball or Squealer or whoever, because they were so unintelligent they would just agree with whatever opinion was being said to them at that moment. At last the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was to be put to the vote. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up, and though occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds, and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet, and shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in favour of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been about equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment, Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be when sordid labour was lifted from the animals' backs. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, ploughs, harrows, rollers and reapers and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water and an electric heater. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just at this moment, Napoleon stood up and, casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. At this there was a terrible baying sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. Okay, remember the dogs are symbolic of the secret police, particularly Stalin's secret police, and think here straight away how they're portrayed. You know, they're wearing brass-studded collars. They came bounding into the barn. They don't seem like pleasant creatures here, do they? They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment he was out of the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only as a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly he slipped, and it seemed certain that they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail, but Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put on an extra spurt, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. Okay, remember Snowball is Trotsky in the Russian Revolution. If we're looking at direct comparisons, they all have bigger meanings than that. But in terms of the Russian Revolution, Snowball represents Trotsky. And just like in Russia, Snowball is forced to leave the farm. Trotsky was forced to leave Russia by Stalin. He was exiled to Cuba, and a lot of his family was actually brutally murdered after this. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment the dogs came bounding back. At first no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. Though not fully grown, they were huge dogs and as fierce looking as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to do to Jones. Okay, that quote is a key quote. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to do to Mr. Jones, because already we're getting this comparison between the old dictator of the farm, Mr. Jones, and this new dictator, this new ruthless leader, Napoleon. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted onto the raised portion of the floor where Major had previously stood to deliver his speech. He announced that from now on the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In future, all questions relating to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs, presided over by himself. These would meet in private and afterwards communicate the decisions to the others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday mornings to salute the flag, sing Beasts of England, and receive their orders for the week. But there would be no more debates. Okay, so this is the end of democracy on the farm. There's no say for any of the animals, just the pigs, just Napoleon, really. It's a classic example of a dictatorship in any era you look at. He's not going to listen to what anyone has to say. It's his rules and it's his ways. And if you don't like it, well, I've got these 9 brutal dogs who will do whatever I say. In spite of the shock that Snowball's expulsion had given them, the animals were dismayed by this announcement. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. Okay, again, that's quite interesting. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. They were too unintelligent to argue about it, so they just have to go along with it and accept it. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. He set his ears back, shook his forelock several times, and tried to marshal his thoughts. But in the end, he could not think of anything to say. Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began speaking at once. But suddenly the dogs sitting round Napoleon let out deep, menacing growls, and the pigs fell silent and sat down again. Then the sheep broke out into tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. Okay, so these pigs tried to raise the discussions, they tried to argue, but the violence of the pigs and the propaganda of the sheep put them to silence. They don't get a say. Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangement to the others. Okay, remember, Squealer is symbolic of the propaganda, manipulation of language, and the media. Comrade, he said, I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labour upon himself. Okay, so that's quite an interesting quote. So we're making it, Squealer's making it seem like we should be feeling sorry for Napoleon because he's doing all this extra work. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. You guys have got to decide for yourselves whether you think Napoleon actually believes that. It's quite obvious what he actually thinks. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves, but sometimes you make the wrong decisions, comrades. And then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, who, as we now know, was no better than a criminal. He fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed, said somebody. Bravery is not enough, said Squealer. Loyalty and obedience are more important. And as to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come when we shall find that Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades. Iron discipline. That is the watchword for today. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back. See, we've got the repetition of that piece of propaganda we had from earlier. The animals are so scared of having Jones back that they're happy for the pigs to decide anything. Okay, so surely, comrades, you do not want Jones back. So Squealer just reels that off whenever the animals are doubting the decision made by Napoleon and the other pigs. Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday mornings was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced the general feeling by saying, if Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right. And from then on he adopted the maxim, Napoleon is always right, in addition to his private motto of, I will work harder. So Napoleon is always right is a key quote for 100% because it shows us that the peasants just followed Stalin in whatever he said. It shows Boxer is naive and he will just do what he's told. And this Napoleon is always right. There's so much you can say about that quote. The use of the word always. It's certain. It's definitive. It's a nice quote just to embed into your analysis as well. Okay. Boxer is just accepting things the way they are because he wasn't intelligent enough to argue. By this time the weather had broken and the spring ploughing had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up, and it was assumed that the plans had been rubbed off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock the animals assembled in the big barn to receive their orders for the week. The skull of old Major, now clean of flesh, had been disinterred from the orchard and set up on a stump at the foot of the flagstaff beside the gun. After the hoisting of the flag, the animals were required to file past the skull in a reverent manner before entering the barn. Nowadays they did not sit all together as they had done in the past. Napoleon, with Squealer and another pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for composing songs and poems, sat on the front of the raised platform, with the 9 young dogs forming a semicircle around them, and the other pigs sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week in a gruff, soliloquy style, and after a single sing of Beast of England, all the animals dispersed. Okay, it's not sounding that different to when Mr. Jones was in charge now, is it? They're all just doing exactly as they're told by Napoleon. On the 3rd Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. He did not give any reason for having changed his mind, but merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work. It might even be necessary to produce to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had all been prepared down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill, with various other improvements, was expected to take 2 years. That evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. Okay, so you've got to think about how Squealer's manipulating the other animals here. Again, using language. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it in the beginning, and the plan which Snowball had drawn on the floor of the incubator shed had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why, then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. That, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill simply as a manoeuvre to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plan would go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated a number of times, "Tactics, comrades, tactics," skipping round and whisking his tail with a merry laugh. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly, that they accepted his explanation without further questions. That last quote there, from Squealer spoke so persuasively onwards, is the perfect quote if you're looking at manipulation in this novella, because it shows the manipulation of language, it shows the manipulation through violence, and it also shows how the animals just accepted it and moved on because they weren't intelligent enough, they weren't brave enough, they weren't strong enough to rebel against the new dictator of the farm. And remember, Orwell is is having Napoleon replace Mr. Jones, because he is saying that revolution is not realistic, a rebellion is not realistic. Someone will always take charge. Okay? Right, so what we want you to do for this lesson is literally just listen to this video, read the chapter, take some notes from the video, and perhaps blow up 2 or 3 key quotes about manipulation. That would be fantastic, okay? Keep going, guys. I know this is really draining having to work from home and you don't have that same support, but we really, really need you to keep up the fantastic work so that we're in the best possible position to get you some fantastic grades next year. Keep up the fantastic work. I hope you stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you in the classroom in a not too distant future.